The tempo. It's not the speed. It's the perception of the speed. It's the pulse. It's not the rhythm. It's the patterns of the different rhythmic figures. It is a meaningful way to organize one's own displacement in the space. Sometimes you have beats off the beat, you have suspensions, you have accents on the beats. You have a lot of things happening in a texture to be only a question of how fast or how slow, because the perception changes. It's a question of elegance, it's a question of phrasing. It's a question of acoustic, it's a question of instrument, it's a question of articulation. There's so many choices you can make to make a phrase very light or very heavy, harmonized or just melodically, perhaps in a two-voice invention genre. Of course, it can be also repeated notes, chords, octaves, and the percussive aspect of the piano then, if it's on the piano alone and not in chamber music with string or winds or voice, then they compensate. But the percussivity of the piano is very much of an element also that gives this illusion that we play faster because we play louder. And then you have the voicing. So important, the voicing. It brings a sense of hearing music in the background in 3D, a little bit like as if you watch a beautiful painting and you start from focusing on the background of the landscape, the colors, the shapes, details, perhaps a cloud. And then you see the foreground and the thematic material in music in analogy. And you realize that your attention is brought by the painter in the way they focalize and they organize the disposition, the composition, so to say, which is the case of their painting. So in a way, if you have a very quick accompaniment pattern like in 18th century, the Alberti bass, it can become so mechanically fast and unfortunately heavy if it's not lightly touched from close up without articulating, lifting fingers. Then it blends in because it gives the harmonic progression, but the harmonic progression with the alternation of the fifth and the third and the root gives that sense of beehive or that sense of oscillation, of a resonance. And then the melody doesn't have to scream because it doesn't have to in order to exist. And therefore the dynamic range, the thinness or thickness of the touch that you can obtain from different textures. Of course the tempo then is what is indicated. Well, because the indication says something relatively moderato or allegro, ma non troppo, but not too much, con fuoco, fiery, or any of these andante compared to adagio, walking or at ease, but walking is pacing, not per se running. That would be presto for rushed. But then it depends of the key signature, of the style, the genre, the instrument to which it was written. A jig by Bach cannot be as fast as the last movement of the second sonata by Chopin, even if both of them are very driven. Of course, one is more perpetual motion like the Chopin, when the Bach has this dotted rhythm or sometimes mostly swinging rhythm of the 6 or 9 or 12, 16 or 8. But then again, how to compare incomparables? Because we play it on the same instrument when we do on the piano. So yes, then we have to touch lightly, we have to be close to the keys, we have to be... In fact, we need to imagine the sound of each individual articulation as if we're shaping in our enunciation the vowels versus the consonants, and each word or letter constitutive in group of a word has to have its shape between the silence before it and the connection with the next note, and then the next note connected to the following note. One is appoggiatura, one is not, one is real in the sense of the tonal note. And then you have also a suspension. You have these ways of valorizing by delaying the arrival point of a sentence point of view. And I find that all this is fascinating because it makes the playing not just a recitation of a metronomic, if existing, because even if it did, it's not always the same perception. That's another thing. The composers compose before the performers perform. And once the performers perform, they realize that certain tempi don't function, just like conductors with orchestra. And of course, Beethoven, in the late years before 1827's death of his, discovered the Viennese store of Melzel, the metronome. And so he retroactively put tempi on his symphonies, but not to his sonatas or most of them. And even so, we don't always respect his tempi, especially conductors with orchestra will tell you it's too fast. Who knows if he knew how to notate exactly what he wanted on the metronome's pendulum's weight? Did he notate what was on the inch under or above? But regardless of this anecdotic situations, I would say that the interpretation involves the tempo, the length of sound, how you want to bridge, arch your phrase, how you want to bring the eloquence, and to which point do you want to bring shape of the phrase rather than the phrase itself. Because you can, as you can overstate dynamically, you can overstate in tempo. When you play a moderately fast tempo, you can still do subarticulations like phrasings by two and staccato, or perhaps tia ta ta tia ta ta tia ta ta ta, two slurred, two staccati. But if you play then you don't have the time to do that or as much or at all. And then it becomes just a mechanical flow of articulations, which the piano is so good at in terms of the modern action, because it's responsive, and if you lift well the fingers you can obtain that. But if you want to organize them into notes which are thematic, tonal, melodically thematic, and well, of course you can enunciate each, but you have to bring it within context, with the direction, with line, and so you can blossom, not accent, one note more than another in order to connect it to the next beat's equivalent note and obtain a flow, a phrasing, a voiced articulation, which then will call for a tempo slightly less fast if, when it's too fast, it blends the articulation to only detached or only legato. And then you have, of course, opposite voices in terms of contrary motions. You have harmonizations. And ultimately, for the pianist, the pedal, which is so much the sauce that goes on all the salads. And the problem is that the articulation is one thing you can control with your fingers. The scratching, the hold and poke, or the over holding, so the air legato or the over legato. And the acoustics already influence compared to the instrument you have to play on. But then if you put the pedal on top of the acoustic, if both are resonant, then you exhaust the capacity of hearing the articulation of the transparency of the elements. I think the texture has to be in transparency. There needs to be clarity, not for the sake of it, but because this way the music breathes. And just because pianists don't breathe to play, that doesn't mean that they have to play breathless or in apnea, musically speaking. And I find that to be very important, because we have to reestablish the bowings, the breathing for the music by the singer, who would need to know how to breathe and where strategically in order to avoid breathing in the middle of a word with two syllables cut off in the middle. Of course, there are no lyrics in solo piano music, but there are phrasings that are and musical patterns in the melodic lines, which the composers want to imitate the voice of the aria with repeated notes which have to be melodic, ta 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 dum. And if you say I love you, so you don't hear the repeated note in the singing because you listen to the words. And in the piano, you can repeat the note melodically by replaying it before it's fully up and not therefore sounding and no more sounding. Rather, just on the edge of its vanishing, replay it and you hear ta-ha, ta-ha. Of course, it demands touch control, and certain of these techniques demand more time. Therefore, you cannot produce them in a certain tempo. At some point of fast tempo, you give up on subtleties in subarticulations. In a slower tempo, you can have more details, but you might lose the arrival point direction of the line, the narrative meaning of the eloquence, of the rhetoric, of the capacity to be convincing by bringing the audience by the hand to bring them to this cadence, to this semi-cadence, to this arrival point, and then connect to the next one, and sometimes not diminish tension release, but tension, and delay the release. And if you have a grace note, then you delay the note that you're gracing by giving it an importance, if it's an interval, ta-da, or on the same note. So a lot of these innuendos in the subtleties of the texture by the composer don't need to be all slashed into the tempo by being squeezed, because we don't want to lose tempo. And if we do too much rubato, then we zigzag so much that we don't have a point. In other words, it's important to organize both the detail and the aim, the breathing and the sounds and their connection in terms of their meaning, how you think they are supposed to mean. And in which way, in which tempo you think you're convincing because you're convinced, you're inspiring because you're inspired, you are becoming not the composer, but the piece becomes you during the performance. Ephemeral moment, you bring it to life, and the audience discovers the piece through you for those who didn't know the piece. So you have a big responsibility to make them like the piece, not didactically by telling them, this and that, and starting to feel through the playing that if the repeat is there, they might get bored. So let's do different dynamics and ornamentations for the sake of it. No, I don't think is right. Sometimes the repeat is just a restatement, which is part of the structure in terms of the construction of the symmetry of the situation, and you just need to play it. You don't need to try to save it by selling it, by seductively trying to distract the listener from an hypothetical boredom. Naturally, the repetitivity today seems to most people used to modern life where everything goes fast and doesn't have a beginning and an end and a form and a structure and an attitude of presentation and in a way a demeanor. It's a lot of the thing go directly to the point in the way people converse. And music of the past had its form within which you had the essence, and so you have to enter in it, but you cannot ignore the form and the structure, and therefore the very spaces that demand. Some of them are part of this redundancy, which is possibly sometimes even a term of endearment if it's a slow movement, or a reassurance, or perhaps a drive that is connected more into the repeat, just enhancing what you already did, not trying to do something different for the sake of it. But if you do, and it's your choice in a Scarlatti sonata that has two halves in a page or two, or some shorter piece like latest Brahms intermezzi, you can imagine that you can restate them with a certain taste of yours about what do I do with the repetitivity, either within the patterns, either through a sign, of course, then you have the page that comes back and you restart. But if it was written and printed through, you might not think of it like that, because you just play what is there. It displays, it's the flow, it's the way the music continuously develops, unveils in front of you its different beauties. And sometimes the composers purposely choose to restate something before they go elsewhere, either harmonically, going to a secondary dominant, or perhaps using the device of the perfect cadence most of the time for classically tonal music ending, but also the deceptive cadence that sounds almost like it from the leading tone up, but not for the dominant going to the first but to the sixth degree. Delay tactics, suspensions, appoggiaturas, ornamentation, grace notes, trills, patterns that change in the decoration, broken thirds, dropping sixths, ascending octaves, broken octaves, or combination of both with appoggiaturas. I find that the pace and the pulse, the melody and the harmony, the structure and the detail are all to be, in fact, taken in account simultaneously. Not because you need to breathe, not because you need to change bow, because you don't. Especially with the middle pedal on the modern pianos and the right foot pedal, you can play extremely unnaturally slow and still have a flow without decay. And then that brings you then to do more subarticulations, but in some ways also it makes you lose the aim of the sentence. And if you find a right synergy rather than middle way, a synergy where you incorporate all the elements of how this music displays itself through you for the audience, or for the recording, or just for yourself, to try to be convinced before to be convincing. And therefore you change mind, you re-listen to a recording that you made in practicing or in progress of knowledge of the piece, and you try to think, I shouldn't slow down here, or that's too fast, or I don't have time. Or it's not only because of technical reasons, but of course often you have to practice to be able to deliver at certain tempo, certain technical demands. But the choice, the strategic choice of a conductor who doesn't play, but you play while you're your conductor, has to be undertaken in a way that you visualize the series of phrases that bring you to a certain arrival point, which would be then, with or without repeat, going further into a modulation through sequence or through surprise in harmonic, or with patterns of common notes. It's like narrative storytelling, where you don't always detail everything. Sometimes you speak in the novel, if you're a writer, about the action more than about the details of the situation. You can be contemplative, and you should be, and you have to be in the action, and you should be, but you cannot be both at the same time. Sometimes you just build the context musically before you start the thematic or melodic material, if there is. Beethoven innovates by combining it with the harmony and the rhythm and the pulse, like the Waldstein chord sonata in the opening. But generally, we have always to have in mind that the tempo is an expression psychologically of a statement in a mood setting that corresponds to a thought process in a narrative style that brings you to express yourself through the piece by expressing the piece through yourself. And it's an eternal search. In a way, you might find it more cohesively in one place, acoustically, than in another. And then you find that it felt natural, the flow. But that doesn't mean much, because everything is artificial, even especially the natural, like actors playing a specific character that goes against their grain, but that becomes believable. And I think this rupture of disbelief for the audience makes them follow the character embodied by an actor who in fact is telling a story of a writer. And in music, we tell the music of a writer who wrote it for us to remember not only the pitches and the rhythms and the basic information of dynamics, but through the innuendos of some of the decorative ornamental indications hint us about how to organize the hierarchy of the meaning of the different notes, which while there have different functions inside the melodic, harmonic, contrapuntal lines. And you have to be able to shape them intelligently, but also emotionally, intuitively as well as analytically, not only the one nor only the other. And this takes time because you change your mind, you explore this, you try that. You might be ending up by being so self-critical that you're never convinced by yourself. I say, I will never make it. It'll never be as I dream it because in a way, the way I imagine it is perhaps unplayable. It's more like an idealization of a moment rather than the moment itself. And I think that with age, we learn to allow that the music talks to us and we talk to it back, but we don't try to seduce through it the audience or try to use it as a path between us and the audience for self-indulgence on stage. I think the music is powerful by what it hints rather than by what it states. And while you have to state it, you have to always leave room for this secondary level of elements that develop, blossom through the structure of the piece and not by the detail of each note. And then while you need to be so attentive for each detail, you have to always consider where is your sentence punctuation and what type of punctuation and how much you care about how you're going to organize the statement from the silence before the piece into that first cadential arrival point of view in terms of the punctuation. And of course, music doesn't mean the same, or the same piece doesn't mean the same thing to the same people, even if we have standardized scores of music published, because there is still this way of the quality of the legato, the propensity to think that music doesn't depend on me. I am here to, as a craftsman, shape it according to what I perceive through the writing I need to do and not more. And if I consider that I am a co-composer and I have to introduce a commentary over the piece itself while I play it, then it takes a different dimension of subjectivity versus objectivity, though I'm not sure anybody can really play objective. Because inevitably, by embodying the piece from the written score, regardless of the teachers, the comparisons of other performers and the existing recordings compared to the past that didn't have such, today is available in such quantities that it's more about choice by comparison, when it should be choice by conviction, by analytical structuring, by emotional connection to the meaning of this long note and this short note, by bridging through and above and beyond your intuitive tension release, crescendo, diminuendo, hairpin, and therefore decide that you're going to tell the audience, carrying it with me, just don't worry, I will bring you because I want to bring you further there. And in a way, like an editor of a film, the way it's edited, it gives the pulse and the rhythm of the action of the scene compared to the raw footage. Same way the stage director makes you follow exactly where the actor is standing to deliver the famous lines of a monologue or a dialogue or whatever it is. There is a subjective opinion of how you present, you bring your music, which is not yours, but, well, in case it is, but most of the time is this of the dead predecessors, through hyphenation of teachers and publishers. And ultimately, I think you need to remain always in quest, but while you play, in delivery, between the playing, in quest of what is the best way to state it. Because sometimes it's intimate and it's emotional and it's almost disturbingly uncomfortable to state it on stage in front of so many people, even if it's not your own statement, of course, but it is the one that becomes so important because you're stating it. And you have to find the right tone of expression, not overstated, not understated, not distant, nor blinded by the details. While the details are the spice and sometimes the flavor and the perfume of the statement remains also a thought. So there is combination of emotion, thought, organization, pacing, and I think that if the performer is not allowed to give a statement of their own within the piece, the artist over the artistic, or the craftsman under the piece, allowing only the piece to exist because he or she places the right notes in the right place. That is, of course, very theoretical. It's more subtle than that, because in reality, honesty and statement of humility serving the piece is because the piece aggrandizes you by serving it humbly and trying to make sure you don't do something that is self-serving, even for the good emotional, inspirational reasons, because in a way you don't want to be constantly self-censoring yourself, but you need to be able to be connected to the statement with a conviction and at the same time with an observation. So you're active while contemplative, driven while detailed, arching a phrase towards a long-term arrival point that is not around the corner of the next, let's say, cadential punctuation of the statement. And I think this is the richness of interpretation. You can come to it by yourself, or you can come to it by combinations of ways you've heard from others and make your own mix between tempo, phrasing, articulation, pedal, direction, line, breathing, understanding, or purposely, provocatively playing it in a way that it doesn't correspond to what you think everybody expects for the sake of it, rather because of your conviction of yours. Between tradition of rubato and how much, not too much, this should be an intelligent reading of the score with the heart and the mind, and translated through your fingers, but in this synthesis of these elements, you cannot separate them in layers. They are all coming in one bundle. Performers know sometimes better the piece than the composer because they spend more time of their life, performing it and perfecting it, if so to say, or trying different points of view until you find what it always elusively you don't reach. It's as if the piece eludes you and is saying, "Come to me, try to find how you're gonna capture the essence of me." Who will really know if it's exactly what's supposed to be, or supposed to have been in the thought of the composer, but it doesn't matter because the piece exists besides the composer. It's in your arms, in your soul, and you play it with your own inner world. And the examples come from tradition, but also from exposition and exposing yourself to the tradition. You can take it as an outside in, or you can take the time to be convinced by it and play all this with a meaning that is yours, even if it's a kaleidoscope of different ways of others. You can play by rejecting things that you don't want to give into, or you can play with a certain abandon and allow it to express itself. And sometimes the piano talks to you, says, "I cannot do this," or you have to make it do so subtle articulations. Subtlety, intuitivity, analytical expression. I think in chamber music with the other instruments, tempi choices are to do with their bowings, breathing, and other elements. And an andante for a violin would be different from an andante on the piano solo with the pedal. Would it be as natural? No, probably not. But it becomes its own different natural. And I don't believe in the oppositions. I believe in the combinations of approaches and the conviction, while acceptance of the difference of the other, who has a different view on the piece, either because they play it with you, either because they listen to you and they tell you that, and you try to find how to combine your texture with theirs, your conviction with theirs, not in opposition or in submission, but in a merging the paths towards one direction. I find that to be the ultimate important lesson of humility and tolerance, while conviction and drive.